Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It is a pleasure to welcome you today to today's webinar, which is entitled Health Profession in a Changing World, the Need for Responsible Leadership. And without further ado, I would like to welcome Mr. Alex Mejia, our moderator, to the floor. Dear Mr. Mejia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much, dear participants. Thank you, esteemed panelists, and particularly thank you to Professor Mike Sachs, the head of the Institute for Responsible Leadership in London, among many other things, for making this possible. To you and to Julie, our sincere appreciation. My name is Alex Mejia. I will be co-host of this webinar today on health professions in a changing world, the need for responsible leadership. I have the privilege of representing the UN agency in Geneva, in charge of the mandate within the system for capacity building, for training, for research, academic research as well, UNITAR. UNITAR was created in 1963 by the United Nations General Assembly, and we are very proud of what we do. Our main mission is to develop capacities, to offer training in developing nations. Last year, 240,000 beneficiaries. So without further ado, I would like perhaps to introduce briefly the agenda that we have ahead, and then also go into a brief introductory right there on the screen. We will have Professor Tracy Adams, Professor Alan Bondwick, Dr. Nelson De Barros, and Professor Susan Nakaro, representing several countries, actually, or based in several countries. But I will introduce all of them properly. Now, to try and put things in perspective, we had put together a very brief presentation. Allow me to deliver it to you, dear participants. And before anything, I would like to pay respect and to remember these millions of persons suffering around the world, 147,539 confirmed cases as of 3:57 p.m. on the 27th of April. But most important, perhaps, and to pay testament to all the dramas and the suffering under that, the ones that have departed, 3,116,444 persons already gone because of the coronavirus pandemic. We are here at the Palais des Nations in Geneva, where I'm speaking, just 2 or 3 blocks down the road from the World Health Organization. And I can tell you that our colleagues at the WHO, in their outstanding effort to try to rally the world to actually focus on this in the proper manner, to give the top priority to the vaccination campaigns and the like, they have issued a call that should be remembered today, a very important call behind those numbers, because we all understood the importance of vaccination in any given country, but we are facing a moral dilemma. And that is something that I'm sure we will be discussing later on in this unique conversation. It is not acceptable that countries that have that can afford, that have the financial resources to buy vaccines and pay for vaccination campaigns as a top priority, are ahead of developing nations, poorer nations that cannot afford to do that. So without politicizing any message here, I simply wanted to invite you, dear participant, to think behind those numbers. It is indeed something that has called the world attention, and there are several things that we will be discussing later on, but we wish that all of the countries will be offering the same resources with the same priority, with the same readiness to everyone. No divide between the global north and the global south. We will get there. Next, please. So you will see also that this is portrayed under the guise of responsible leadership. Before I get to a brief definition of why is it that responsible leadership is, I would like to mention that the UN agency that I represent, UNITAR, is very, very pleased to have worked with Professor Mike Sachs and the executive director of the Institute for Responsible Leadership out of London, our colleague Julie, to actually create and launch this unique organization, not-for-profit organization based in the UK, to bring to everyone interested in understanding the fundamentals of leadership. What is it that responsible leadership is about, and how, in practical terms, you go about improving the leadership that you may have, mostly in the public sector, if I may say, but also in the private sector and in the third sector. I'm a career diplomat, a former senior government official myself, and I can tell you that if there is something that is not only important but urgent, is to train the younger generation and everyone in public service on this thing. Not only leadership, not only public policy, not only public administration, but the essence of it all, the sense of duty, responsibility, and mission that is behind this concept. So allow me to postulate a brief definition. What is responsible leadership? Responsible leaders in both the private and public sector treat the stakeholders with integrity to ensure the issues of sustainability, ethics, and the wider public interest are best addressed. And there are several definitions. This is a basic one. We will be ruminating about other definitions as well, but let me focus on the word at the center: integrity. There are very academic definitions. I'll give you a very basic one. After all, I come from Ecuador. I'm a proud Latin American, and for us and for many cultures represented here, the verbal tradition of passing knowledge and principles continues to be important. My grandfather used to say, integrity is to do exactly the same when nobody's watching. And I remember that. Of course, I can give you, and you can give me, the distinguished panelists, a lot more structure of a definition and a scholarly definition, but I love that one because it has guided me well. I learned it when I was just growing up, and I try to be transparent in that particular way, and I encourage everyone, even though we are not perfect, of course, at least to remember what integrity really is and how it affects your leadership style. So what makes a good leader during a crisis? Leaders face the task of reassuring the public and persuading them to follow through on government decisions. They should offer a rapid recognition of the danger, the necessary infrastructure, the various procedures in place to clearly gather that data once the crisis has hit, the sense making. But all of these things should happen keeping responsible leadership in mind, because the last thing that we want to see, especially in public service, is to hide things, is to do things in a less than transparent manner. That is not responsible leadership, and especially in the middle of a global health crisis. Now, we do have a definition of political scientist Arjen Boyn from Leiden University in the Netherlands. Effective crisis leadership cannot be brought about by simply doing the right thing on the ground. Instead, leaders need to craft a good narrative that helps clarify the problem and unite the population if they are to attain the permissive consensus that is essential to be able to make decisions and formulate policies. It's called legitimacy. Responsible leadership, as I say, is necessary in every aspect of life, be this the public sector or the private sector or the third sector, civil society and the like, media, academia, but particularly when you have a public leader making decisions and communicating them. Next, please. So from a brief introduction on the pandemic and remembering the numbers to a definition, basic definition of responsible leadership, let me share this very succinct, basic graph from Forbes magazines entitled "No Institution Seen as Both Competent and Ethical." And there you see the vertical axis from ethical to unethical, the horizontal axis to less competent to competent, and how you can build an argument on where things are situated. You see to the left of that the 2020 Edelman Trust Barometer, which measures society's trust in government, business, media, and NGOs across the globe, reports that trust is built on a leader's ability to demonstrate two strengths: competence and ethics. Not only competence, but competence and ethics. In other words, in order to earn trust, leaders must demonstrate both that they are shaping their decisions and perspectives based on knowledge and ability, and that they are acting with society's best interests at heart. Critical. Now, to build resilience during a crisis, a country needs effective leadership in both government and business. Leaders need to communicate in a way that inspires confidence and unifies communities by being open about the evolving nature of the problem. Seems to be very obvious and logical. It's important to remember it here. Without this transparency, the public can quickly sense deception, reducing the credibility of the government and trust in their policies. The initial message from the government should then be delivered quickly to avoid all the contrasting narratives, which offers guidance, instills hope, shows empathy, and suggests that leaders are in control. Why these things? In these few slides and in these few minutes, we know that the vast majority of the people registered here are civil servants, as I am, are people working in public entities. This is a good moment to remember this, dear colleagues, dear participants. And if I can call your attention to the Edelman Trust Barometer, go and read exactly what our societies in several countries actually think of how government operates and the need for a different kind of leadership, perhaps. Next, if I may, Julia. To land all of this on the issue at hand today, we will be discussing, of course, the health profession, healthcare and responsible leadership as part of that. Healthcare systems are composed of numerous professional groups, departments, and specialties or specialists with intricate nonlinear interactions between them. The complexity of such systems is often unparalleled as a result of constraints related to different disease areas, multidirectional goals, and multidisciplinary staff. Responsible leadership is paramount for a functional healthcare system, especially because, as you just heard, of the amalgamation of disciplines, of tasks, of responsibilities and roles, and so on. And I think, Julia, the next one is the last one, if I may. Thank you. Yes, indeed. We will have then, with this basic reminder of where we are on the pandemic, on what is responsible leadership and how it applies perhaps to the health profession. Let me now give the floor to our keynote speaker, Professor Mike Sachs, a good friend of the house, an emeritus professor at the University of Suffolk in the UK, also visiting professor at the University of Lincoln, the Royal Veterinary College, the University of London, the University of Westminster, and also at the University of Toronto in Canada. Dear Mike, thank you for making this possible. The floor is yours. You are still muted, if I may.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alex, for noting that. And thank you for a fantastic introduction. And I just wanted to endorse the fact that your grandfather has given you very good advice. And I think it's something that we should all reflect on in our own particular neck of the woods, as it were. So, Julia, could you pop on the next slide, please? So we're talking about health professions in a changing world, and I'll be hoping to demonstrate to you that the world is a very changing one, both in the global north and in the global south. But in order to sort of establish my street cred, I just would say that aside from all my involvement with various universities as a visiting professor and also on the executive and board of many universities, I will most relevantly say that I have been a Dean of Faculty and Head of School of Health for 10 years in my career, published many books on health and the professions, and I've been a chair and member of many health bodies, both inside the NHS and outside. And as part of this, I've been an international advisor to professions and governments in many countries, particularly on the health area. And I also actually am vice president currently, having been a president of an International Sociological Association research committee on health, previously on professions. And as Alex has kindly said, I've assumed the role of chair of the UN-sponsored Institute for Responsible Leadership, of which I'm very proud, as I am of recently being appointed to be a member of the World Health Organization Technical Expert Group on Health. Next slide, please. So we'll just sort of cut to the chase in terms of my presentation. And I want to highlight that professions have faced many challenges over the past few decades, from clients and citizens, the state, corporations and organizations. And there have been other challenges as well. We won't mention COVID-19, we've already had that. That's been a seismic challenge, as has, shifts in technology and other kinds of issues that have applied, no less to health professions as compared with professions more generally. And what I want to do in this keynote for the webinar is explore the role of health professions and professions generally, and that of responsible leadership in a very fast changing world. And so although the webinar does focus on modern neoliberal societies in the global north, it also considers the sometimes different and very much more extreme challenges in many countries faced by health professions in lower income countries. And in so doing, I want to raise some questions about the role that health professions may play globally in the future. So I'm going to start the presentation with reference to the professions in the neoliberal societies of Britain and the United States. And I talk about the professions generally because this is a subject of my newly published book on professions, a key idea for business and society, which I'll say more about at the end of the presentation. But in the 90s and 40s and 50s, there is no doubt that law and medicine were legally bound, autonomous self-regulatory groups, which could basically do more or less whatever they wanted independently, whether they were based on national registers or state-by-state licensing, as in the United States. And in the area of medicine, this was definitely a top dog profession, which even within the ranks of professions in healthcare held much greater sway than other largely marginalized and subordinated semi-professions, as they have been termed, like nursing or allied health groups. And they're also somewhat resilient to influence from patients and indeed other consumers of services. They were very much independent, autonomous groups. But this really has changed very relevantly with the rise of the counterculture. And Julia, I think we've got a fairly graphic slide on this. I'm always a sad person because I can remember all this going on in the 60s and 70s. Won't say too much about the 50s, but it was a very exciting and revolutionary time. Next slide, please. And this development of a counterculture in the 60s and 70s was really the beginning of a much wider and more sustained attack on professions going forward, and particularly elite professions. And so there was, as central to the philosophy of the counterculture, a belief that, we placed too much emphasis on scientific progress, and there were limits. Whilst it was helpful, there were limits to this. And there were some alternatives to professions in dealing with some issues, some of which related to self-help, for example. And certainly there was a kind of kickback in terms of the notion of professional depersonalization and disempowerment, and a drive by consumers to exercise greater control over their lives. And this really instigated a challenge to the widespread public deferentialism to professions and their monopolistic powers, which has really been sustained. And so the days of, there being sort of unquestionably trusted groups of professions based on codes of professional ethics as a key feature has in some ways been undermined and has most definitely been receded. And this is sort of this is really illustrated by these wonderful sort of pictures from the 60s of the reassuring doctor and the reassuring judiciary and the wigs and so on. And this has changed fundamentally. And so one of the most interesting things has been that in healthcare particularly, Ivan Illich, who is one of the foremost critics of the medical profession, as it were, as it has developed in a high technology system, actually argued that there comes a point where medicine, having been extremely useful, can become counterproductive if we're not very careful. He drew on the Greek concept of nemesis, which means that we will be punished for, we will receive retribution for striving to become godlike and immortal, because it's a very distant point on the horizon, and there is a danger that sometimes clinical damage outweighs the benefits of medical intervention, that sometimes patients' rights to care for themselves infringe on their privacy, and occasionally too that people can be alienated with illnesses by repressing pain and extending sick life, which is not high quality life. And he argued too that people could be turned into passive consumers rather than autonomous producers in relation to their health. So next slide, please. And here is a picture of Ivan Illich. And, you know, I remember him well from the 70s, but he may not be so familiar to people involved with this presentation. He was a Roman Catholic priest, mainly operating in South America. And he saw professions, whether in the developed or so-called developing world, he saw them as a form of imperialism. And now his argument in many ways is flawed, you know, because he overstates the issues of side effects of modern medicine and so forth. And in some ways, I think his perspective leads to, you know, conceptions of euthanasia and other things which would not be necessarily morally acceptable. But this sort of, in some ways, instigated the challenge to health and other professions at a time of great change. So next slide, please, Julia. So in terms of, you know, the post-Illich era, there are several things that have happened over the last sort of 4 or 5 decades since Illich was writing. We have seen growing public scandals involving the professions, whether this be medical malpractice, serial killing health personnel, of which more later, and ill-advised operations. And we also have, in the contemporary context, this nihilistic postmodern ideology about professions, which has been, if you like, instigated by the fact that people have access to Google. And so if they have something wrong with them, they can not only go to their doctors, but or their other health practitioners, but in fact, they can go on Google and find out, you know, well, what might be wrong with them, you know, and this democratization of knowledge has really led to some diminution of the power of the health professions, because it does mean that there isn't so much of a monopoly on healthcare knowledge. And indeed, you know, at the extreme level, there has been growing support for a free market ideology, because it's seen that this is obstructed, the professional monopolies have obstructed supply and demand in a way that militates against the public interest. And as I say, this is quite an extreme view, originally launched by Milton Friedman in the 1960s in a book called Capitalism and Freedom, where he said, you know, that basically in medicine, for example, doctors' monopolies drive up income and status to the prejudice of the public. They restrict places in medical schools, and indeed they stifle innovation. And so this is perhaps one extreme end of the spectrum. But these are the challenges, including a suspicion that professions have sometimes served their own group interests rather than the public interest, have led to further threats to the professions. Julia, thank you. And as I've noted in my recent book, these have been manifested in a number of movements. One has been by clients and citizens, because these parties have actually sought the extension of choice and voice through more public engagement with professional bodies, more representation, greater involvement as consumers, where they have more information about the healthcare practitioners that they actually see. For instance, you know, they might want to know the mortality rates associated with particular surgeons that they want to go to. And also there's been this movement towards more self-responsibility for health. And a second party, which has been very important here, has been the state. And the state in countries like Britain has increasingly intervened to protect the public against professional malpractice and to provide a more regularized set of standards than those that professions themselves have sometimes been unable to adhere to. And thirdly, there's been a great impact, particularly in the United States, of corporatization. You know, for example, through third-party insurers who have, in a sense, reduced the status and power of the medical profession, even in this society, in a more privatized economy. And in general terms, increased bureaucracy in organizations has more widely constrained professional operation. So if we go to the next slide, I would like to illustrate this in relation to Britain, because up to the 1970s, Britain, certainly from the viewpoint of medicine, had exclusionary social closure, meaning that it had a monopoly of title, which meant that this occupation had exclusive rights on the term medical practitioner, and this gave several other rights within the health system. There's a register of practitioners, people with this title. There was legal protection of the title of doctor, as I've said. There was state funding of medical practice, which meant that many other practitioners, particularly those like alternative practitioners, were prevented from gaining access to National Health Service funding. There was also control over the curriculum, growing specialization, and dominance over the rising number of limited and subordinated professions, which was really echoed, I think, in the term applied to allied health professionals. These were professions supplementary to medicine, not really standing in their own right, as one would see in the current context. And there was very little involvement of the voice of users in the provision of medical services. However, although alternative practitioners could still practice, even if they couldn't use the title of doctor, they were still at a market disadvantage, as I've indicated, and therefore less privileged in terms of income, status, and power. So next slide, please. This was all to change with a range of regulatory reforms over the last 50 years, including the introduction of general managers in the NHS to try and pare back the power that doctors had, the creation of an internal market, the purchase of provider split, and the development of a citizens' charter with greater rights for users. Now, these were all laudable initiatives, but unfortunately they have very little impact because doctors took over most of the general manager posts themselves, and the purchase of provider split did not achieve the desired effects. And the rights to users were not really very substantive. They were mainly, you have as a right as a user to a named nurse, for example. And so, whilst it's important, it didn't really make much inroad to some of the fundamental challenges that the profession was facing. And so I think we saw, as we'll see in the next slide, if we could go onto that, yeah, we will see that the government decided to take more radical action in relation to the professions. I mean, not just medical profession, but the other professions as well. And this particularly came under New Labour from 1997. And one of the initial effects was to lead to a re-stratification of the medical profession, in that general practitioners, from being sort of a very low status aspect of the medical profession, became suddenly right at the center, and their standing rose in some cases to a position above that of medical consultants. And so there were shifts that this brought about. But I'm more interested in what the global effects were on particularly the medical profession here, in terms of the increased sensitivity there was by government to patient choice and public protection. And this led to far more far-reaching reform, accelerated by a growing series of healthcare scandals over the last 20 or 30 years that I'll now outline. Some of these scandals were just crazy. They had surgeons operating on children, with very high mortality rates as a result, which has really raised many issues about ethics. Children's organs were removed without the permission of relatives. This is deceased children, and this was for medical experimentation and museums and so on. And there were issues of multiple service failure around the notorious case of Baby P, where a whole range of professions failed to protect this child from abusive parents. And there was also the activity of a child-killing nurse, Beverly Allitt, who was sort of bumping off young children in hospitals and babies. And more recently, just within the last decade, there have been multiple failings identified at the Mid Staffordshire NHS Trust in terms of the kind of duty of care of health practitioners, not just doctors, but a whole range of practitioners. But the most notorious case, which really instigated major change, was that of Dr. Harold Shipman, who is known to have murdered 200 or more of his patients. He had a power complex. And in many ways, it was an interesting case for me because I was actually conscripted into service as one of the main advisors to not only the General Medical Council on this case, but also the Department of Health in terms of what was to be done. But the result of these kinds of cases actually led to major changes. And so we went from a position where doctors, once they'd received their certification, could practice forever and a day, to actually a situation now where doctors have to be revalidated every 5 years, and they are subject to regular appraisal and independent disciplinary processes. And this is a major change. And we have greater lay representation on the General Medical Council. I addressed the General Medical Council about Harold Shipman. And at the time, there were over 100 members of the General Medical Council. It's completely unwieldy. And my brief was, tell us what we should do in the wake of Shipman. And the answer is you can't sit on your hands. You've got to do something fairly radical. Otherwise, the government will do it for you. But now the General Medical Council has been slimmed down to just 12 people, 6 of whom are lay representatives, and only 6 are medical representatives. So the balance has changed. And there's certainly a lot more transparent data about healthcare professions generally in terms of patient choice. And health and social care professions have been brought closer together. A meta-regulator has been introduced for the health professions, the Professional Standards Authority for Health and Social Care, that oversees all health professions in Britain. And these reforms really marked a transition, which I think is nicely captured by Chamberlain, who says that we've moved from professional self-regulation to regulated self-regulation. So there's still some self-regulatory powers that doctors and other health professions have, but because of the rollout of this, and this is not just for doctors, but it's also for nurses and the allied health professions, there's been a lot more state intervention. And so I think this brings us to the next slide. I love metaphors, and anyone who knows my work will know that I do. And I've written a book with a Swiss collaborator, a Swedish collaborator, on a sort of book on professions and metaphors. And in this case, I think it quite helps to understand the changes that have occurred. I believe that we've moved from zoos to circuses to safari parks. The zoo is when we have the classic self-regulatory framework of professions. The cages they build themselves, and they operate in a fairly exclusionary manner within these. But I think then we've seen, particularly with the Labour government's reforms, the notion of a circus, where we have a more regulated environment where there's a ringmaster, and the ringmaster is the state who makes the animals perform to an accepted standard. In this case, it's the professions. But increasingly, we're moving to a more collaborative environment in which we have a safari park, where we've shifted to moving to encourage selected professions to work together as part of teams. And that's become very much a motif for the modern age, and not just in terms of professions, but in terms of other workers. So next slide, please. This is a fairly dramatic slide just to highlight the zoos, circuses, and safari parks. Metaphors are not accurate depictions of what happens, but they do actually help us understand. They're aids to understanding. So we can move on to the next slide. Thank you. But I would say that when I talk about Britain, I am also talking about many other societies, the richer, societies in which, say in continental Europe, although there are different regimes for managing professional work, they're not all based on legal closure. In many cases they are, and I think that this is particularly true in my eyes in countries like Australia, Canada, Germany. And there have been similar trends in these countries in terms of moving forward the regulatory agenda. And we have actually seen professions increasingly reined in by the state. And particularly in Scandinavia, we've seen ever more empowered citizens engaging in greater self-help, which has been quite an interesting trend. However, you know, it's not perfect. It is a major improvement. The medical profession has worked positively with some of these changes, but there are still issues which need addressing in terms of, you know, implementing the higher quality standards and greater accountability and collaboration. And there are still distances between some physicians and their patients, and there are still hierarchies within the health professions, which can sometimes provide, you know, certain obstacles, and they can indeed be infighting, you know, in terms of professional territory. But I think this dysfunctionality is exacerbated when we consider the relationship between health professions, including medicine, in neoliberal countries and support workers, because, you know, support workers have been, you know, almost completely neglected in this, in the global north. And this is really unfortunate, because one of the other trends in terms of the changing environment of healthcare in the last 50 years is that we're facing an increasingly aging population with a rising number of chronic conditions and comorbidity. And support workers are actually by far the largest part of the healthcare workforce on the ground. So we need to avoid myopia in looking at health and the personnel concerned. It's not just health professions, it's also the support workers. And I think in looking at this, professions themselves have some responsibility in dealing with those who deliver face-to-face care, but they're not necessarily professionalized. They have some responsibility to actually ensure that they're better regulated in a consistent way. They need to take some of these support workers under their wing. They are doing this, but it needs to go further, and the support workers need to have more than just standard employment and health and safety legislation, you know, underpinning their operation. They need a little bit more regulation, a little bit more support in terms of training and other things. So if we move on to the next slide, Julia. But of course, as Alex has very much highlighted in a big way, one of the biggest and more recent challenges for health professions, aside from dealing with all these regulatory issues, has been really dealing with a very fast changing climate in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I want to say a few words about this. Next slide, please. So facing the challenge of COVID-19 is obviously a terribly sad event for many families, many people, millions of people across the globe. But this has positively enabled health professionals in neoliberal countries to show their more laudable qualities. You know, there are lots of people who, you know, in the medical and other healthcare professions who have been absolute saints. They've worked long hours under very telling circumstances, difficult circumstances and hardships under lockdown. And, you know, it has been incredibly laudable, and this has been acknowledged in many societies. But this task, along with the often invisible work of support workers, has been made even harder by issues such as the absence of appropriate personal protective equipment, PPE, to shield them from the COVID-19 virus. But despite such challenges, there has been a really good technological silver lining for health professions. I mean, just to say that, you know, changing technology is very important as another shifting societal context in which professions work. And in the past, you know, we dealt with the microscope, the stethoscope, radiographic imaging, and all the impact this has had, and 3D printing of medical parts, microsurgery and stem cell science. But now we're seeing through COVID-19 that more can be done based on technological development, including things such as virtual consultations at a distance. I've just been on the phone this morning to my GP, you know, having such a consultation, and that wouldn't have happened a year or two ago. And we have seen the increasing employment of telemedicine. That's all been to the good. So hopefully these will be constructively incorporated by health professions into the new normal when it arrives in the post-COVID era. So next slide, thank you. I want to say though that really when we're talking about health professions in the global north, we do need to understand the particular predicaments of those in the global south, where there are very different and more extreme challenges faced by health professions. Although health is a human right and enhancing it is part of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, there is this very difficult dilemma where there is a lower gross domestic product and associated higher mortality and morbidity rate in low to medium income countries in the global south. And challenges are also posed by the fact that there are lower number of doctors per head of population and indeed other health professionals than in richer neoliberal countries in the global north. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to be clear about global north and global south. So the areas of the global south are defined by the red areas in this particular map. So I really want to focus on those just for a few moments. So the next slide, please. When I say the number of doctors is less in neoliberal countries in the global north, in the global south, in the global north, there are about 1.5 to 4 doctors per 1,000 population. But the WHO data shows that over 40% of member states have less than 1 doctor per 1,000 inhabitants, and 26% have less than 0.3 doctors per 1,000 population. And this isn't made up by other health workers, health professionals, because in nursing and midwifery, for example, of over 20 million nurses and midwives worldwide, half of member states have less than 3 per 1,000 population, and a quarter of member states have less than 1 per 1,000 inhabitants. This is a very extreme divide, which we need to be very aware of. And I think we go on to the next slide. And so the challenge of this has been of regulation of the health professions, the fewer health professions in the global south, has been met by providing extra training for change. And I've been sort of like impressed by the fact that in Brazil, doctors are practicing newly recognized forms of complementary alternative or of complementary and alternative medicine with additional training. And this is one way of actually moving forward the quality of the labor force in this area. And also, we need to understand, though, that it's not all wonderful, because if COVID-19 has interrupted quality improvements in the global north, it has even more interrupted quality improvements in the global south, because of the more limited technological infrastructure in terms of implementing some of these very positive changes in terms of virtual consultations and telemedicine that we see being implemented in the global north. And clearly there need to be delicate balances in moving forward with initiatives like increasing the number of physicians, because this has been recognized in Asia Pacific countries as potentially being difficult because of the problem of diminishing the quality of graduating doctors. So it's a difficult balancing act. Next slide, please. And we also need to see beyond the explicit regulatory requirements. And I think that what stands as a requirement in low to middle income countries is not always what happens on the ground. I'm not picking on India, but just a recent piece that I was published in one of my co-edited books showed that, by Calnan and Kane, showed that whilst there are all these formal regulatory requirements for medical and other health services and state health boards in India, which look like they develop standards, protocols, norms, and guidelines, there is also direct regulation of doctors through the Medical Council of India. The system is not what it seems. It's Riven, Calnan, and Kane argue with non-compliance, lack of enforcement, bribery, in some cases corruption and overcharging. And so we need to get below the surface so that we can begin to, with great leadership, of course, so that we can begin to move this situation forward in countries in the lower middle income sector, which suffer from this issue. Next slide, please, Julia. Unfortunately, there is a double whammy for the lower middle income countries, because it's not only the number of health professions that's disproportionately spread, but it is also the fact that the non-professional health workers are less well represented in these societies. So we see that in African countries with less than 1% of the world's financial resources in the global south, they bear 22% of the global burden of disease, and their populations have access to only 3% of health workers. So you can begin to see some of these terrible dilemmas that are actually faced in the global south as compared with the global north. And so this means that such societies are more dependent on the smaller proportion of support workers who play key roles in orchestrating mass public health education initiatives and large-scale vaccination efforts and so on, you know. And I think such support workers are likely to be less well supervised and supported, given, you know, the growing strain on the few health professions that actually exist in carrying out their tasks. And I think that it is also true that there are issues about the level of training that exists. And this was highlighted in a recent article I saw in Human Resources for Health, which was about South Africa and community health workers in primary healthcare. Fantastic initiative, but you know, there were issues about the level of training in working through the agenda of screening for diseases and risk factors and providing basic educational health issues. So these frailties are also underlined in other countries like Kenya, where there is a lot of stuff to be worked out in terms of scopes of practice and other things. Next slide, please. So as we move towards a conclusion, I just would like to say, in the light of all the criticisms that have been made of health professions, if you could give the next slide, please, Julia, it may be that we sort of think, well, perhaps we should get rid of health professions, health and other professions. No longer may they be helpful at a time of significant social change. Well, I want to argue very strongly to the contrary. I think that professional reform has come a very long way. Professions remain central to our society, including in health, of course, and to disestablish them, as the free marketeers suggest, will be disastrous, as it would, amongst other things, remove the protection of certified expertise and codes of ethics. It would lead to the principle of caveat emptor, let the buyer beware, when people are not always fully informed about health issues. It would increase the levels of bureaucracy and cost in running current professional affairs, and most importantly for me, it would destroy the public interest buffer between professions and the state and corporations. Next slide, please, Julia. However, I think there's no doubt that professions just can't stay as they are. They need to reform. And this applies to their receptiveness to technological change, their part as mediators and managers of risk in a risk society, their capacity as trusted interpreters of information, the empowerment and partnership they have with users, the need for greater, more constructive engagement with corporations, the acceptance of public interest accountability to the state, and the avoidance of this sort of protectionist attitude that was very common in the period before the 1970s. And they need to assume a stronger future position as positive promoters of change. So going through the next slide, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but in terms of responsible leadership, Kempster and Carroll argue that we should have explicit frameworks as to what responsible leadership represents. And they introduce 10 precepts: attention and commitment to social responsibility, pervasively throughout the team and the organization and society, going beyond shareholder and shareholder focuses to taking stakeholder perspectives, to relying on ethical assumptions of a duty to do no harm and to do good, and a sensitivity to global intercultural issues, citizens and cosmopolitanism. Next slide, please. And so the other 5 are a broad outcome orientation, engagement with questions of purpose, a center on shared opinions, connecting stakeholders together, a focus on the use of resources, identifying where and when disruption is necessary, and taking a long-term stakeholder view rather than a short-term shareholder view. And these precepts, I think, are very helpful, but I don't think they go far enough. And particularly in my role as chair of the UN-endorsed Institute for Responsible Leadership, I want to argue they should be pushed further. Next slide. And the Institute for Responsible Leadership, if people are interested, is not only, you know, sponsored by the UN, which we're very proud of. It's a not-for-profit organization based in London, seeking to make the world a better place for private and public benefit. And in line with its philosophy, in line with Alex's comments, its touchstone is that responsible leaders in the private and public sector treat stakeholders with integrity, which we've heard about, to ensure that issues of sustainability, ethics, and the wider public interest are best addressed. Next slide, please. And it has these principles of promoting leadership integrity, resonant with corporate social responsibility and sustainability, to offer courses, seminars, accreditation, mentoring, coaching, research support in responsible leadership, providing higher quality input and facilitation through its founding members and its associates, and publicizing fellowships, and we have a number of these, as examples of good practice. You know, we only have people as fellows if they are exemplars in this kind of sense. And I'm delighted that Alex is amongst our several fellows that we have. And we are also currently promoting a charter on responsible leadership for companies and organizations. If you want to know more, please do feel free to go onto our website, www.responsible-leadership.org, or to contact the Chief Executive, Julie Search Whitaker, on the address given. Next slide, please. But this alignment with the United Nations leads me to say that in terms of the 10 precepts outlined, we also need to align ourselves to a greater extent with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. These are really important, and I think they provide an even more granulated touchstone against which health professions and professions generally should be looking to orient their work. And these range from, you know, reducing poverty, which is obviously clearly a factor which is very much linked to ill health, improving the quality of education, to providing, if you like, more sustainable cities and communities, and to ensuring sort of peace and justice. You can see the 17 SDGs represented here pictorially. And I want to conclude, and this is the final slide really in terms of my presentation, that in my book on professions, which I'll just say a little bit more about in a moment, the concluding page on the is very much a fable, because I think most of us would know the Arabian Nights tale of Aladdin and the evil sorcerer who tricked Aladdin's wife to trade in the lamp containing the powerful genie, who, you know, in coming round and saying, basically, he wanted to trade new lamps for old. However, I think the real problem here is that in exchanging the old lamps of the professions for the glittering new ones of the future, as professions and health professions readjust to the new environment, we need to be really careful that we're not mistakenly giving up the lamp with the magic genie that can grant the owner's wishes. This lamp is the one which contains the altruistic and ethical ideologies of professions of the past that we continue to need in the modern world if professions are to help us to successfully transition to an age through responsible leadership in accord with the public interest. And I'd just like to go on to the next slide, which is some absolutely shameless publicity for my book that was published literally last week on professions, a key idea for business and society. And you will find a number of ideas more generally about health professions and change, which are also sort of, if you like, filtered through into other occupational groups like lawyers and accountants in business and society. And you will see from this slide that if you enter a code FLY21 at the checkout, you will actually get a 20% reduction on the book. So that's great, isn't it? And that's certainly in the public interest. So next slide, please. I'd also would just like to say something, because this is material to our speakers on the panel, our excellent speakers on the panel today. I do also co-edit a book series called The Sociology of Health Professions. And this centers on the production of high quality original work in the sociology of health professions, which is particularly centered on innovation and it's centered too on policy relevance. And so our aim is to stimulate debate about the sociology of health professions, to influence policy development of practice, to make a significant contribution to thinking on health, and to produce original national, international work of recognized high quality. So final slide, please. I just would like to say that we now have published 3 books in this series. One was on professional health regulation in the public interest, of obvious relevance today in terms of our discussion, and also a second book that I edited with a cast of a couple of dozen people on support workers and the health professions in industrial perspective. This book is the first book on the academic book on the invisible providers of healthcare, and therefore is quite significant. That came out last year. And this year, I'm delighted to say we have a new addition to the family, which is on the allied health professions, a sociological perspective, which was written as a monograph by Susan Nancro and Alan Borthwick, who are 2 of our esteemed panelists who'll be commenting on the presentation that I've made, and I've now finished. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Professor Sachs. Excellent picture, by the way. I am always impressed with the wide knowledge that you can display and that can help us indeed put in perspective the topic at hand. 2 very short comments for our distinguished participants. We will move now to the panel proper, with the 4 panelists that I will have the pleasure of announcing very soon. And also, I wanted to ask you to use the Q&A to post any comment or question that you may have. We will be happy to select some of those questions to present to the panelists so they can give us some reactions and comments. Every panelist will have 5 minutes, and then we will do another round with a couple of minutes for each one of them. So without further ado, and thanking again, Mike, your presentation and your commitment and support to make this possible. Allow me now to introduce our first panelist, Professor Tracy Adams, professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Western Ontario in Canada. Professor Adams, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Let me just say it's an honor to be here. I'm really happy to have this opportunity to talk with you today and to provide a comment and some elaboration on Mike Sachs' presentation, of which I am in quite a bit of agreement. And so I'm just going to talk about some concordances, I guess, with my own research and some of the findings that are related to health professions in a changing world and responsible leadership. Next, please. So I thought, just for context, I would explain a little bit about my research, because my identification of challenges and some of the advice for leaders that I have is based on my own research. And so I'm a sociologist who studies professional work and regulatory change. And my research has touched on healthcare professions broadly, especially regulated professions. It's tended to focus on Canada, but Canada in its international context. And so I've looked at a broad range of groups, both just sort of a summary of everything regulated and the challenges that regulated health professionals experience, but I've also done case studies of a number of select occupations, from dentistry and dental hygiene, chiropody, podiatry, naturopathy, nursing, osteopathy, chiropractic, to name just a few. And my research builds on a number of methodologies. So a lot of my research is historical, archival, and based on document analysis. But I've also been doing interviews with professionals, regulators, policymakers, to try and understand the challenges facing professions today. And I've done some survey research as well. Next, please. So based on this research, my findings really, I think, resonate with a lot of what Dr. Sachs was saying. There's a lot of challenges facing professions right now. So this is really, I think, a key moment for leadership, because there's a lot of opportunities for leaders to kind of grapple with these problems and bring health professions forward and help meet the challenges. Some of these challenges again have been mentioned already today. Challenges worldwide with access to services, with having sufficient healthcare resources, for having the right resources in the right places, and just so that people have access to good, solid, dependable healthcare. And of course, the costs associated with educating, training, and offering services, costs for states that are funding systems, costs for individuals that are accessing services, and a broad array of services, because not all services, even in countries where there is universal healthcare, not all those services are covered. And of course, with the pandemic, we've really become aware of some challenges that probably were pre-existing, but just seem more acute now. Challenges such as managing healthcare crises while balancing other healthcare needs, some more mundane and routine healthcare needs. Challenges facing healthcare providers in terms of work intensification that predated the pandemic. A lot of healthcare workers are having to do more for less, work harder, work smarter. And that really has been leading to burnout and mental health issues and fatigue, and also helps exacerbate ethical dilemmas, because this drive for efficiency, this push to do more and to hurry, 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 sometimes can lead to ethical problems, or ethical violations and ethical dilemmas. So, sometimes providing good, safe healthcare sometimes takes time, which healthcare practitioners don't always have. Of course, the pandemic has also highlighted issues of diversity, inequities, and fairness, both within countries and outside and beyond, in between countries. And these are obviously crucial and ones that really need to be rectified moving forward. In terms of healthcare professional regulation, which is where I do a lot of my research, a number of challenges, Mike Sachs mentioned several. Some of the ones that I wanted to highlight here are the politicization of healthcare provision and regulation. That a lot of leaders sort of think about what's politically expedient when it comes to regulating professions and dealing with healthcare decision making, and not necessarily always what's healthcare expedient. And this is exacerbated really by anti-expertise sentiments that seem to have risen with populism and neoliberalism, and become very common amongst some state actors and many members of the public as well, where healthcare professionals, healthcare workers as experts are actually seen as untrustworthy or not worth listening to. And of course, this is really problematic, especially when you're dealing with healthcare crises like we are right now. A lot of this concern with the anti-expertise, I think, also has facilitated regulatory change that's really focused on identifying bad actors, right? To try and identify and get rid of healthcare providers that are causing problems and really behaving badly. In my interviews with regulators, they suggest that that's probably about 1% of their registrants. So I think we may be putting a lot of resources into this, catching these bad actors. There may be broader public interest concerns that regulators should also be maybe paying attention to. Also, we have this sort of levels issue, right? Healthcare is often a need at a local level. But how do you manage these sort of local demand with often national and international pressures and frameworks and inequalities? Balancing those different levels requires, I think, leadership at multiple levels and a lot of collaboration. And Mike has already mentioned technological changes and advancements in telehealth, virtual care, and care across jurisdictional boundaries are really positive developments. I agree with him, but they are creating challenges for regulators often, especially in my own country of Canada, where regulation is at a regional level. And so in opening up opportunities for healthcare that goes across regions, on one hand, this is a really good thing, but on another, it creates a lot of regulatory challenges, again, in which I think we really are at need for some leadership. Next, please. So I just want to wind up by talking about the potential role for leadership and leaders in dealing with these crises and these challenges. And I think, again, the pandemic has shown us the need to be flexible and adaptable. And so I think leaders will have to be flexible and adaptable as they collaborate and work together towards making positive change. I think it's important to depoliticize, reduce politics in the process, and again, try and keep our goals, towards improving healthcare and improving access and all these other challenges that we're having, and try and minimize the role of politics in that. And again, I've said that this, this politicization has been linked with sort of anti-expert sentiments, which I think leads to an almost demonization of healthcare workers as inherently selfish. Now we have the opposite during the pandemic with these discourse of healthcare workers as superheroes. And I don't think, honestly, either one is particularly helpful. I think we need to recognize that healthcare workers are people, and they're there helping and providing services to other people. And I think we need to prioritize dignity for everybody in the system. And once we prioritize dignity for all stakeholders, we may find ground for stakeholders to work together collaboratively, to recognize common interests across levels, across countries, across jurisdictions, across professions, and really try to work more collaboratively towards the same goals. And again, I think that's going to take considerable leadership. But that leadership is also going to have to keep diversity, equity, and fairness in mind, because obviously we have a lot of inequalities, again, within country, cross countries, that we really need to address, and that needs to be prioritized, and ethics as well, as Mike has emphasized. We need to find ways of balancing local needs with national and international contexts and balance pressures at these multiple levels. And again, I think this will involve leadership collaborating at different levels. I think we need a broader conceptualization of the public interest. Again, it's not necessarily only minimizing harm, but doing good for people. And again, like Mike, as he ended, I really feel that it's important for leaders to look forward, but to not automatically dismiss the past, that there may be things that are working or have worked, and that we need to kind of build on what might be working, work to identify that, and then build on that to move forward. So thank you.
Thanks to you, Professor. Quite interesting, holistic. We will use part of this, hopefully, for a Q&A. Without further ado, allow me to introduce our next panelist, Professor Alan Borthwick, Emeritus Professor at the University of Southampton in the UK, and a member of the Council and former Vice President of the Royal College of Podiatry. Dr. Borthwick, the floor is yours. Welcome again.
Thank you very much for the invitation to contribute. It's an honor to do so. Mike's presentation and book speaks of the recent challenges and threats to professions, which may arise from the state, the public, or other professions. So I hope to briefly illustrate two of these threats using examples from the book recently published by Susan and me, which focuses on the allied health professions, mainly in the UK and Australia, citing the case of access to the use of medicines by the allied health professions. It will show how professional monopolies, albeit diminished, may in some ways continue to interfere with supply and demand against the public interest, and certainly where the state intervenes to protect the public through standards, sometimes set in legislation, but which may be both enabling yet restrictive at the same time. Could I have the next slide, please? Thanks. This slide provides a context to the issue. It shows the state agenda in seeking to address workforce and healthcare needs because of an aging population, with greater demand for the management of long-term chronic conditions. And this, of course, involves a new way of working where roles or tasks that were previously exclusive, perhaps to one profession, in this case, the medical profession, may also be now provided by others, if they're competent to do so. And Nicola Roxon, the former Federal Health Minister in Australia, made that clear in her comment back in 2008. In contrast, sociologists such as Elliot Friedson or Nikki Britton have pointed to the importance to professions of retaining exclusive authority, especially over practices which are considered to be core to the profession's identity. Could I have the next slide, please? Prescribing of medicines is one such example. Non-medical allied health professions are now enabled to prescribe, by changes to legislation in support of workforce flexibility, but they actually remain constrained by the limitations imposed by the enabling legislation. This is because AHP, or allied health professions, independent prescribing is not equivalent to doctor prescribing, and it employs built-in limits preventing allied health professions from fully utilizing their skills. As a result, relatively few allied health professions are presently acting as independent prescribers, as these November 2020 figures show us. Okay, next slide, please. Thanks. This is brought into sharp relief and sharp focus, I think, by the development of new roles, which are not specific to a given profession, but which require skills that can be delivered flexibly by those with the competence to do so. One example is the rheumatology practitioner. This may be an occupational therapist or a physiotherapist or a podiatrist, any of whom may be capable of providing care in long-term rheumatoid conditions. However, the enabling legislation of medicines is profession-specific and is thus an obstacle to allied health professions from fully utilizing the full range of their skills when adopting new roles. So the scope of prescribing practice is limited by the requirement to have a defined scope of prescribing. Thanks. Next slide, please. Yeah. I just wanted to return, if I may, to Mike's text, which highlights the importance, which I thought was fascinating and tremendously interesting and useful, the importance of altruism and ethicality, because of course, as Mike pointed out, this is traditionally part of the ethos of health professions. And responsible leadership in the allied health professions, in this particular little case example, is perhaps evident in the ethical and responsible approaches to governance in their use of medicines through competency frameworks, outlined curricular frameworks governing training and education, codes of practice, and the necessary statements of scope that each profession has had to make. Thanks. Thanks very much.
Thanks to you, Professor, for those comments, very specific indeed. And as mentioned, we will hope that right after the panel, we stimulate a discussion with some questions and answers also received so far. Allow me now to introduce our next panelist, Dr. Nelson Felice de Barros, Associate Professor in Sociology and Health at Campinas University in Sao Paulo, Brazil. He is also a visiting scholar at the University of Leeds until a few years ago, and Royal Holloway University of London until a couple of years ago as well. So, Dr. de Barros, it is a pleasure to welcome you here, and especially knowing that you come with a very particular experience from your country, Brazil. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mr. Alex, and thank you so much, Professor Mike, for the invitation to take part of this panel. And it's a great pleasure. And well, I will present a very sensitive material from some happenings in Brazil, and try to present a perspective about what is happening in Brazil now. As you said, as you know, we have a big crisis. Pandemic crisis in Brazil is enormous. So for me, my argument in this presentation is we are facing worldwide the consequence of negationism, and especially in Brazil. And I have two main arguments related to this. Part of the negationism has been built by the health professionals' strategies to keep their autonomy. And the other part has been based on fake news and distortion of the historical record. So I will explore each one of these items. So related to health professionals' strategies to keep their autonomy, and PAHO, that means Pan American Health Organization, what is part of the World Health Organization. They publish in their page the available evidence of the benefits of using chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine is insufficient. Most research so far suggests that there is no benefit, and warnings about side effects of the drug have already been issued. PAHO, Pan American Health Organization, recommends that they be used only in the context of properly registered, approved, and ethically acceptable studies. However, next slide, please. And however, the Federal Council of Medicine, or Brazilian Federal Council of Medicine, decides that it is the decision of the attending physician to carry out the treatment he deems appropriate, elucidating to the patients that there is no proven benefit in the pharmacological treatment of this disease and obtaining free and informed consent. The fundamental point that underlies the Federal Council of Medicine's position is the absolute respect for the physician's autonomy in order to treat as he deems most convenient his patient. That means the Federal Council of Medicine, against the idea of the PAHO related to there is no evidence to use chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine, the Council of Physicians in Brazil gave them the autonomy to decide to use or not this kind of medicine, even without any positive use related to it. On the other side, about fake news and distortion of the historical record, on March 24th, last March 24th, the Health Directorate General Personnel Department, Brazilian Army, the Ministry of Defense in Brazil, published the technical note called Considerations about COVID's Alternative Treatments in Brazilian Army. And next slide, please. The military authors quoted, distorted and improperly, the idea of alternative medicine from this paper to support the use of medications such hydrochloroquine, chloroquine, ivermectin, and all this kind of medicines, among others, that they put in their note have so far no efficacy or scientific evidence in the treatment and or prevention of COVID in any of its evolution stage. So, next slide, please. In conclusion, to my argument is the responsible leadership role of the health professionals in a changing world puts as an ethical issue that they must be more committed to the patient's health literacy and health system literacy. And also, they must be more committed to society than to defense of their professional autonomy. That means part of our problems related to COVID in Brazil are related to the defense of professional autonomy to decide, even without any proof or evidence, even against the PAHO or the World Health Organization, they can keep their autonomy and use drugs without any efficacy in the treatments. So we put this as a big problem to responsible leadership that open or reopen this question related to Brazilian society and other societies also. And when we have to put this power relationship in discussion, and the COVID pandemic brought this questions to us again. The health professionals still trying to keep their professional autonomy against the commitment with the society and commitment with the patients to develop the health literacy and health system literacy. So thank you so much for the invitation again.
Thanks to you, Dr. Nelson. Quite unique experience you have shared, and an example indeed of how responsible leadership is indeed critical. To conclude the panel, last but not least, allow me to invite our next panelist, Professor Susan Nancarrow, Health and Higher Education Consultant with 20 years of international experience, a former Deputy Vice Chancellor for Research and Professor of Health Sciences at Southern Cross University in Australia. Professor Nancarrow, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the welcome, Alex. And it's a pleasure to be in the company of so many of my favourite sociologists. I'm going to end the night by, I guess, drawing together some themes that have come up in most of the presentations, and particularly Mike's presentation, but it also draws on over 20 years of my own experience in health workforce analysis in Australia and the UK, where I've looked at ways to address workforce shortages in response to large-scale policy changes like the European Working Time Directive, population changes, things like poor workforce planning, but most recently COVID-19. And some of these things we cover in the book that Alan and I have recently co-authored. But innovative ways to respond to workforce shortages are likely to be an important issue for health leaders as we emerge from COVID-19, and have been particularly relevant as we've seen a number of change in policies that have had to quickly free up the workforce to respond to needs. So I'm going to condense those 12 points into 4 subheadings: training, substitution and adaptation, increasing supply, and increasing workforce efficiency. So when we think of increasing the availability of the workforce, training is the thing that normally comes to mind. However, it's probably the least efficient. Traditional training models are slow, typically a minimum of 3 to 4 years to get a professional into the workforce. They're expensive, they're not particularly flexible, and they often create supervision and capacity problems, both during training and for new graduates when we have a need for supervision, clinical supervision while people are training, and new graduates come out and also create needs for supervision. So other approaches that we can look at are incremental training models, where we've got the possibility of step-on and step-off programs, where workers achieve a marketable skill before they reach the end of their full professional qualification, or the growth of micro-credentialing, where workers are trained to meet a specific need quickly. And examples of this include phlebotomists, cast technicians, and newborn hearing screening specialists. And more recently, we've seen the growth of degree apprenticeships. These are growing in the UK. We don't have them in Australia yet, where only 20% of the training is provided in universities and 80% is provided clinically. So the practitioners are providing capacity while they're training. Next slide, please. So with substitution and adaptation, we see a number of periods of workforce shortages like COVID-19 are a really opportune time for professions to demonstrate how nimble they are at moving into other roles and repertoires. This example here is something that we see commonly in Australia. It's not due to COVID, but we see the substitution of, for example, physiotherapists and exercise physiologists where there are shortages of one for the other. But in particular, in COVID-19, we saw several examples, for instance, of nursing and allied health practitioners stepping into critical care roles that weren't their traditional domains. And in Australia, while not rapid, we've seen the introduction of several new roles. I'm specifying Australia here because we have a particular regulatory and funding framework that tends to facilitate the growth of new roles, and particularly the self-registered profession framework, in a way that, for instance, the monopolistic NHS does not. One example is a new profession called a developmental educator, which has responded to meet the needs of people with learning disabilities in the community. They evolved from a politically incorrect and fairly outdated model of mental retardation nurses, And they've used an allied health professionalisation framework as a way to gain social closure and get a monopoly advantage in a growing market for disability services. The next one is increasing supply. Next slide, please. Thank you. And in addition to training process approaches, there are several ways that we increase supply. Most of these are self-explanatory: attracting qualified workers back to their profession, increasing participation rates of the existing workforce, and reducing attrition. The first two tend to require dedicated policy responses. Often things like recency of practice rules prevent re-entry into the profession, and we've seen that COVID-19 has seen the relaxation or expediting of many of these rules to bring workers back into practice. The photo here is of a 94-year-old nurse. We also see the highly feminised health workforce, particularly in areas of nursing and allied health, suffer from lower participation rates. And so there's a need for gender equitable parental leave and childcare policies to really increase the participation rate in these workforces. Reducing attrition is more complex because it tends to rely on local factors and sometimes structural career issues like burnout or injury due to repetitive work. So it can be harder to address these on a global level. And finally, increasing workforce efficiency, which to me is one of the most interesting areas of workforce capacity in my mind. The term ditching the dirty work was first coined by Hugman in '91 and talks about delegating lower skilled or less risky tasks. Sorry, it's the next slide, please. To a less skilled workforce. But it depends on having access to a delegate workforce. It's also important for the delegating workforce to maintain control over the division of labour, or they tend to lose ownership of the tasks that they delegate. And we've seen some historic examples of that. In Australia, we had shortages of podiatrists and they delegated some of their foot care to nurses and lost control both of their division of labour and of the quality of the tasks they were delegating. Funding models in a fee-for-service environment don't always support a delegated workforce. Delivery and appropriate funding of group-based interventions as opposed to individual interventions can be a way of increasing workforce capacity. Other options, and some other people have touched on these, are the introduction of telehealth and group telehealth models, the creation of hub and spoke models where we have specialisation in the hub and a generalist practitioner can engage the services of a more specialised practitioner to meet smaller sections of the community. And we've seen examples of this in rural and regional practitioners, and they're often supported by telehealth. So in conclusion, this was a rather whiz-bang tour of strategies used to respond to workforce shortages, but the implications for leadership are things that people have touched on elsewhere. Leaders need to be flexible. They need to be focused on the needs of their communities, populations and patients rather than the professions. And they need to ensure flexibility in their approaches to training and models of care that are best able to meet the workforce needs to meet those populations. Thank you.
Thanks to you. Indeed, we are part of the societal debate on how to better understand and foster a virtuous cycle and outcome of this profession. It's more relevant than ever because of the COVID. One of the comments that you mentioned on perhaps taking too long to prepare to the level required, a professional, a health professional, is indeed one of the topics to discuss. So we are going to move to the Q&A, but because we know that time is short, I wanted to ask Julia, thank you, to do the usual and to take the group picture. If our colleague Julie Serchi-Whitaker can also connect her camera, that would be very good. This is something that we normally post on our social media channels. So if we can all just look at the camera briefly, and then Julia will also take a picture, I will thank you. Whenever you tell us, Julia, you take the picture. And while she does that, thank you. Thank you, Julia.
Of course.
While she does that.
3, 2, 1. Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you indeed. Thank you. And thank you for these few seconds. We have to have a testament and memorialize these things. So let me open the Q&A. And I would like to mention as the first comment or question, something that came from Dr. Michael Hopkins. Michael is an old friend of the house, former senior UN official that now has dedicated his life to promulgate in developing nations a better understanding of what is CSR, corporate social responsibility, as you know. Michael does an impressive work in actually postulating the linkages between responsible leadership and the role of corporations towards society. He's also a member, a founding member of the IRL in London. So Michael wrote the following question: how can responsible leadership help reduce the spread of COVID, especially in countries such as Brazil and India? What is the direct link or linkage between responsible leadership and perhaps a better outcome out of this pandemic? Any comment that you may have, dear panelists, on why responsible leadership perhaps could have led to a better outcome so far?
Yeah, I think the key for me, Alex, is was actually in Tracy's presentation, and indeed, you know, which had shades of the other presentations as well, in terms of calling for flexible and adaptable leaders, you know, who are responsive. And I particularly like the emphasis that was given to collaboration, because I do think in some of the societies where, you know, COVID has sort of taken off in horrible ways, I think there could have been a lot more learning from other countries. And I think what we are getting into now is a situation where, you know, interface and joint working between countries is more and more important in terms of solving some of these issues. Like, you know, there are very difficult balances for countries like India, for countries like the UK, you know, in terms of how do you balance the health risks of COVID against running the economy, which can also have health implications in terms of a negative. And, you know, there are sort of some fairly fundamental issues. And I think individual societies have often, following Susan's lead, you know, they've often experimented, you know, different kinds of models, different ways of working. And I do think this would have been very helpful in certain contexts, you know, in Brazil, in India, and other countries. And I'm sure there is a kind of overarching frame here, particularly in terms of the WHO and in terms of the UN umbrella, that can be extremely useful in terms of responsible leadership in these situations.
Thank you indeed, Mike, for those ruminations. To foster perhaps a greater understanding of the specificity in the profession, I wanted to focus on Professor Tracy Adams, something that she mentioned in her presentation. You say that there is this work intensification, ethical dilemmas behind it when it comes to the medical profession, to the health professions mainly. Can you give us some additional comments on that?
So this is based on my research on not only health professions, but also professions in other fields. And in interviews with some professionals, they have described to me just the constant go, go, go pressure. And that there are times when having time for reflection, to spend more time with patients, to hold hands, to not rush life or death decisions. You know, the time is necessary. And if we're constantly prioritizing efficiency over everything, right, like over dignity and other things, just so that we can do more, treat more patients more quickly, then I think that really does create dilemmas, because it goes beyond healthcare professionals' commitment to, you know, do no harm, to put the services they're providing first. You know, and sometimes they feel like betwixt and between. And so it was those kinds of situations I was talking about that I think you know, again, we're recurring, and these were coming up in interviews well before the pandemic. And so when you think of the massive workload that's added to the pandemic and some of the ethical dilemmas that arise there over treatment when you have in places that are being overrun, you know, few beds, few care providers, too many people, it's just, it has obviously a devastating personal impact, but a broader impact as well. So I would just hope that leaders consider, you know, yeah, it's exactly really what Mike was saying about just the balancing the different priorities. And that if it's all about the efficiency or if it's about the economics, there is really a cost to bear in the health. And that can have, yeah, again, it often is felt in terms of these ethical tensions.
Thank you so much, Professor Adams. Now to Professor Borthwick, I'll ask you a difficult question. When in my time in government, I understood that public policy, the role of the state, how to set an actual legal framework and so on, it's easier said than done, right? In your presentation, you mentioned that doctors will need to be prepared to let go of some of the work that others can safely do based on a publication from by Roxon, I think 2010 or 2008. But in this changing to the medical and the health professions, in what the future will come, telemedicine, the things, the fractures of the health professions that have come to the surface because of the COVID, but also the virtues of the health professions that have come to the fore. Let me ask you this difficult question. What do you think is the proper role of the state to ensure that society benefits the most of the health professions? What is the state supposed to do? Please.
Thank you for that question. That is a tough one, isn't it? Because of course, I suppose a lot depends on the individual nation states and the different structures they have. But broadly speaking, if I were to take my own country, the UK, as an example, then there is this sort of dilemma which sits between the extent to which the state should intervene and the extent to which the professions should be able to perhaps self-regulate. And I think in some senses that in Britain, perhaps we have here a sort of a reasonable balance of that in some ways, in that there is a point at which, without a doubt, that the state has a responsibility, or should perhaps have a responsibility to its people. But at the same time, there is a difficulty around trying to do that to a very high degree, in the sense that it might constrain the ability of the professions to undertake the work that they do. And I was struck by, as I mentioned earlier, Mike's comment about perhaps a path to the future lies in somehow recognizing the capacity of the professions to have this altruism. It was part of as Mike's book has pointed out, the earlier views of professions tended to stress altruism, but since the counterculture and so on that Mike spoke of, it's become less popular to assign that status, as it were, the use of altruism, the application of altruism to the professions. But to throw that out is perhaps to throw out the baby with the bathwater a little bit. And there are instances, and there is evidence out there to demonstrate that the professions are capable of acting altruistically. And I think that's something that perhaps state intervention, where it is necessary, is a good thing, but where it needs to be moderated and perhaps into the future changed by virtue of the way that we can bring out, as Mike has pointed out strongly in his book, recognize again that professions are not purely self-interested organizations and structures. They can be used for good.
Indeed, and I thank you for that. Now, to Professor Nelson Felice de Barros, the case of Brazil, quite unique. I wanted to ask you about fake news, because if you can extrapolate the concept of responsible leadership, and we postulate that it applies to anything and everything in the public sector, in the private sector, in the third sector, and the like, media, and I did mention media in passing, media also requires responsible leadership. But the problem that we are facing in this day and age is that media, as we used to conceive it, is no longer the vehicle to get your news, right? It has been highly decentralized in a process that is very much welcome, I believe, but also a process in which there is no real governance. So anyone can post whatever on any platform. And then it's up to the individual to come and determine this is fake news, this is not. This is the type of treatment that I should undertake. This is something that I shouldn't do, and so on and so forth. So very confusing, very complicated. And in the case of Brazil that you mentioned, I want to be very careful, and I have to say this, Dr. Nelson, I'm sure you'll understand me. At the United Nations, we take no side. We remain neutral. This is why it's still in existence after 7 decades. And we do have member states. Brazil is a member state here that we greatly respect. They give us policies and instructions that we follow, but we foster dialogue. So in your opinion, how, in the case of Brazil, these issues of fake news can be prevented? Please give us your comments.
Yes, Mr. Alex, I understand perfectly your position, and I I agree, and I thank for your question. As much as I understand, the responsible leadership is this, it is a different role from the professional leadership or traditional leadership. That means, as a responsible leadership, you must work to produce a kind of symmetry of power. And part of this work to produce symmetry of power is to avoid to defend only your autonomy or only your own position and put some of this power to social control. So, putting some arguments in your question about fake news, when the professionals are very worried to keep their own autonomy, they avoid, or they don't work to put energy to create clear information or knowledge. That is a kind of benefit to keep people with bad information. It's a kind of a position. Of course, doubt is a good business for media, for some part of the markets, right? So responsible leadership must work on to produce a kind of clear news information. And other words, this Federal Council of Medicine could produce a kind of an internet place or website discussing what they call fake news or confident news, because other institutions in Brazil has been doing this, presenting the news and discussing this information. There is no evidence about this, or this information must be related to fake news. So the health professionals could produce this kind of good information to Brazilian society, and they avoid this. So
correct, and perhaps even, if I may echo your words, Dr. Nelson, a code of conduct in which every professional under a formal media entity, or just posting by herself or himself, adhere to this code of conduct. But thank you very much for those ruminations, very important. And last but not least, now we are kind of running out of time, but this is a very interesting conversation. I have a question for Professor Nakaro. You mentioned, Professor, that perhaps the way that our societies are producing health professionals is not the most efficient one. and sometimes it takes too long and so on. I'll tell you in a few seconds a very personal experience. My wife and I have 3 daughters. The oldest of them is studying medicine in King's College London, a program that is 5 years, and then she is supposed to go, God willing, very soon, 2 years to the National Health Service practice, for lack of a better name. We had to decide either to send her to study medicine in America or to study medicine in the UK. And in America, I'm sure you know, it takes 8 years as opposed to 5, and so on and so forth. And we found, the little that we know, but we did the research, that are very comparable programs. So give us some comments following what you say, that perhaps new models of trainings need to be introduced for society so the health professions can indeed serve society better with the same quality, but faster. Please.
Oh, you've been asking some very difficult questions, and that's another one. I guess I think I would always start by focusing on the needs of the community, and I think we've spent the last 150 years focusing on what it takes to become a professional, and the professions themselves have moved the bar higher and higher to increase their credibility. And I think we now have some fairly overqualified workforces. Now, there is certainly a need for a highly qualified workforce in many cases, but I think the example that Mike gave at the start and others had also alluded to, there's a lot of information that's freely available, and in fact there's a lot of work that can be done without a human being at all, and there's been some quite interesting experimentation with artificial intelligence and emergency responses in the NHS, as I understand it. So I think we have an obligation to focus on what society needs, and I actually noticed one of the questions, and so I'm a bit concerned about answering this way, but largely developing a competency-based workforce that matches the needs of society and aggregating the competencies into roles that meet the needs of society. And yes, that does lead to a precarious workforce, and we need different ways to organise and structure the workforce to meet those needs. But the reality is, and Alan's and my book focuses on this a lot, we spend a lot of time constructing a workforce which we then disaggregate and reaggregate in new ways to meet the needs of society anyway. So, and we're on the cusp of some radical changes with technology now, telehealth, and also the delegation of the workforce. So we have the tools to recreate the workforce. I don't think we have the tools to reward, regulate and structure them necessarily, but I don't think they're far away.
Yeah. Indeed, and thank you. And it is, after all, a dynamic environment, and technology will have an impact on the way we train professionals in the future, as you correctly say. Very good. Thank you so much for all these comments that have helped us to discuss in a very constructive way, I think, this very topical issue, responsible leadership and the health professions. Thanks to all of the participants as well that have congratulated you, dear panelists, on the comments, on the questions and answers, and that has also postulated some of the questions that I presented to you. I would like to conclude by expressing our appreciation again to Professor Mike Sachs. As I mentioned at the beginning, this wouldn't be possible without Mike and Julie. Julie Search Whitaker is an excellent professional leading the Institute for Responsible Leadership in London, and a very close colleague of ours at the United Nations. So to both of them, to Julie and to Mike, my congratulations on behalf of the United Nations and on behalf of UNITAR, and of course to my team as well. Julia, you did a great job today. Thank you as always, and we look forward to the next one. With this webinar is concluded. Thank you. Have a good day. Bye.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Thank you.